Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the centuries, to a time when the world was vast and mysterious, when distant lands were connected not by wires or waves, but by footsteps and hoofbeats across endless deserts and towering mountains. The story of the Silk Road begins not with a single road, but with a dream of connection. Picture the year 138 BCE, during China's Han Dynasty, when an emperor named Wu gazed westward from his palace and wondered what lay beyond the known world. He dispatched a brave envoy named Zhang Qian on a mission that would change history forever. Zhang Qian's journey would take 13 years of wandering through hostile territories, of capture and escape, of discovery and wonder. When he finally returned home, he brought with him tales of magnificent kingdoms to the west, of strange customs and precious goods, of horses that seemed to sweat blood and grapes that grew as large as eggs. But the Silk Road itself was far older than Zhang Qian's famous expedition. Archaeologists have traced fragments of silk in Egyptian tombs dating back to 1000 BCE, suggesting that these delicate threads were already traveling thousands of miles from their birthplace in ancient China. The Chinese had been weaving silk for perhaps 3,000 years by that point, having discovered the secret in their mulberry groves, where tiny silkworms spun cocoons of shimmering thread. This secret was so precious, so valuable, that Chinese emperors made it a capital crime to reveal the methods of silk production to outsiders. The penalty was death, and for centuries, the mystery held. The route that would become known as the Silk Road stretched approximately 4,000 miles from the ancient Chinese capital of Chang'an, which we now call Xi'an, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. But it wasn't really one road at all. Imagine instead a vast web of interconnected pathways, branching and rejoining like the tributaries of a great river, some routes passing through scorching deserts where the heat could kill a traveler in hours, others climbing through mountain passes so high that the air itself became thin and precious. The main route split into northern and southern branches as it approached the fearsome Taklamakan Desert, whose name, whispered by travelers, meant go in and you won't come out. Along these routes, goods changed hands not once but dozens of times. A bolt of silk might begin its journey in the workshops of Chang'an, be sold to a merchant in Dunhuang, traded again in Samarkand, purchased by a Persian trader in Baghdad, and finally arrive in Rome or Constantinople, its price multiplied 100-fold from its origin. This relay system meant that few merchants ever traveled the entire length of the Silk Road. Most knew only their own section, their own oases and caravanserais, their own languages and customs. The Silk Road reached its first golden age during the Tang dynasty of China, roughly between the years 618 and 907 CE. During this era, the city of Chang'an swelled to become the largest city in the world, home to perhaps 1 million people, a glittering cosmopolitan metropolis where you could hear a dozen languages spoken in the markets, where Buddhist temples stood alongside Nestorian churches, where merchants from Persia and India and Central Asia walked the same streets as Chinese scholars and poets. The Tang emperors embraced the foreign and the exotic, and their capital became a mirror of the world itself. But silk was never the only treasure moving along these ancient routes. Spices flowed eastward from India, their scents promising warmth and flavor, while jade traveled west from the mountains of Khotan, carved into objects of beauty and power. Glassware from Rome amazed Chinese nobles with its transparency and delicate colors, a substance they had never seen before. Precious metals, gemstones, incense, and perfumes, paper and gunpowder, tea and porcelain, all these and more journeyed along the Silk Road, each commodity carrying not just economic value but the dreams and desires of distant peoples. And with these physical goods traveled something equally precious and far more transformative: ideas. Buddhism made its way from India through Central Asia and into China along these routes, carried by monks and merchants who built cave temples and monasteries at oases along the way. These travelers copied sacred texts, translated sutras, and spread teachings that would reshape the spiritual landscape of East Asia. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road represents one of the greatest cultural exchanges in human history, a gift that transcended commerce and connected human hearts and minds across vast distances. Rest now, and let these images settle in your mind. The camel caravans moving slowly across dunes of sand. The merchant examining silk by lamplight in a distant city. The monk copying scriptures in a cave temple, his breath visible in the cold mountain air. These are the threads that begin our story, the first steps on a journey that will carry us through centuries and across continents, following the ancient highways of the Silk Road. Let us continue our journey, moving now to the great oasis cities that dotted the Silk Road like pearls on a string, places where exhausted travelers could rest and resupply, where cultures mingled and merged in ways that created something entirely new. One of the most legendary of these cities was Samarkand, a name that still rings with mystery and wonder. Founded over 2,500 years ago, Samarkand grew wealthy on its position at the crossroads of routes coming from China, India, and Persia. The city became renowned throughout the ancient world for its gardens and orchards, for its skilled craftsmen who worked in metal and glass, and for its papermakers who had learned the secret of paper production after Chinese prisoners were captured following the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. This battle, fought between the forces of Tang China and the Abbasid Caliphate in what is now Kazakhstan, would have consequences far beyond its military outcome. The captured Chinese artisans taught their Arab captors how to make paper, and this knowledge spread rapidly westward, eventually reaching Europe and transforming how human knowledge could be recorded and shared. Imagine for a moment the Bactrian camels that made this long-distance trade possible. These weren't the single-humped dromedaries you might picture, but rather the two-humped camels of Central Asia, creatures magnificently adapted to the harsh extremes of desert and mountain. A Bactrian camel could carry loads of up to 500 pounds and travel for days without water, storing fat in those distinctive humps. Their thick, shaggy coats protected them from both searing summer heat and brutal winter cold. A caravan might consist of hundreds of these animals, moving in long lines across the landscape, their bells chiming softly in the desert silence. These camels were so essential to Silk Road trade that they became valuable commodities themselves, bred and trained with great care by the peoples of Central Asia. The dangers of the Silk Road were as legendary as its treasures. Travelers faced not only the harsh elements, sandstorms that could bury entire caravans, and mountains where the cold could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, but also bandits who made their living raiding merchant caravans. Some of these bandits were merely desperate men, but others were organized groups that controlled entire sections of the route. To protect themselves, merchants traveled in large groups, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and they hired armed guards. The Chinese government established military outposts along the route, small fortified towns where soldiers watched over the road. Yet despite these precautions, many travelers never completed their journeys, their bones joining the countless others that marked the way. Among the most fascinating stops along the Silk Road were the cave temples of Dunhuang, located at a critical junction where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert met. Beginning in the 4th century CE, Buddhist monks began carving caves into the cliff faces near this oasis city, eventually creating a complex of nearly 500 caves filled with sculptures and murals. These caves, known as the Mogao Caves, became a repository of art and scripture, and in 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu discovered a sealed chamber that had been hidden for nearly 1,000 years. Inside were over 50,000 manuscripts and artworks, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. These documents included Buddhist sutras, but also contracts, letters, music scores, and texts in over a dozen languages, providing an extraordinary window into life along the Silk Road. The Silk Road was also a highway for innovations that would reshape civilizations. Paper, which we've already mentioned, was just one of many Chinese inventions that traveled westward. Gunpowder, initially developed by Chinese alchemists searching for an elixir of immortality, made its way to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, where it would revolutionize warfare. The compass, printing techniques, and the stirrup for horseback riding all journeyed along these routes, each one a gift from one civilization to others, each one changing the course of human history in ways their original inventors could never have imagined. The cities of the Silk Road developed their own unique fusion cultures, especially in the region known as Sogdiana, roughly corresponding to modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The Sogdians were master merchants and translators, speaking multiple languages and acting as intermediaries between East and West. They established trading colonies from China to the Mediterranean, creating networks of trust and kinship that made long-distance trade possible. Sogdian merchants were so successful that their language became the lingua franca of Silk Road trade for centuries, a common tongue that allowed a Chinese silk merchant to negotiate with a Persian spice trader, even though neither spoke the other's native language. Food, too, traveled the Silk Road, transforming cuisines across continents. Grapes and wine moved eastward from Persia into China, where they were cultivated in imperial vineyards. Walnuts, pomegranates, and cucumbers all made this journey. Traveling westward came peaches, apricots, and oranges, fruits that would become staples in Mediterranean orchards. Tea, perhaps China's most famous culinary export, began its global journey along these routes, though it would take many centuries before tea drinking became widespread in the West. Spices like cinnamon, cardamom, and pepper moved from South and Southeast Asia, their value so great that they were sometimes literally worth their weight in gold. Let your mind wander now through the markets of these ancient cities, where the air is thick with the scent of spices and incense, where silk hangs in shimmering curtains of color, where merchants from a dozen lands bargain in a dozen tongues. Feel the warmth of the desert sun, hear the splash of fountain water in a caravanserai courtyard, sense the excitement and possibility that filled these crossroads of civilization. The Silk Road was more than a route for commerce. It was a meeting place of humanity, where strangers became trading partners, where ideas mixed and merged, where the world learned that distance was no barrier to connection. As we journey deeper into the story of the Silk Road, let us turn our attention to the extraordinary individuals who walked these paths, and to the empires that rose and fell along its length. Consider Marco Polo, perhaps the most famous traveler of the Silk Road, though he came relatively late to its long history. In 1271, at the age of just 17, young Marco set out from Venice with his father and uncle on a journey that would last 24 years. The Polo family traveled through Persia, across the Pamir Mountains, and through the deserts of Central Asia, eventually reaching the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China. Marco Polo would serve in Kublai Khan's administration for 17 years, traveling throughout the vast Mongol Empire, witnessing wonders that Europeans had never imagined. When he finally returned to Venice and dictated his travels to a writer named Rustic Hello while imprisoned during a war, many dismissed his accounts as fantasy. How could such marvels exist? Yet his descriptions of paper money, coal burning for heat, and the organized postal system of the Mongols were all accurate, glimpses of a civilization that was in many ways more advanced than medieval Europe. The Mongol Empire, which reached its greatest extent in the 13th century, controlled an enormous stretch of the Silk Road, from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road experienced what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a period when a single authority guaranteed the safety of travelers across this vast territory. The Mongols established a sophisticated system of way stations called yam, spaced about 25 miles apart, where official messengers and travelers could find fresh horses, food, and shelter. This network was so efficient that a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other, covering thousands of miles, in just a few weeks. The Mongols actively encouraged trade and protected merchants, understanding that the wealth flowing along the Silk Road enriched their empire. But the Mongol peace brought with it an unexpected and terrible consequence. The very networks that allowed goods and ideas to flow so freely also allowed disease to spread with unprecedented speed. In the 1340s, the Black Death, or bubonic plague, began moving along the Silk Road from Central Asia. The disease traveled with merchant caravans and Mongol armies, carried by fleas on rats that stowed away in cargo and supplies. By 1347, the plague had reached the Mediterranean, and from there it spread throughout Europe. In just 5 years, between 1347 and 1352, the Black Death killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, perhaps 25 million people. The Silk Road, which had connected civilizations and enriched cultures, had also become a highway for one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Among the cities that flourished along the Silk Road, few could match the splendor of Constantinople, which the Greeks called Byzantium. Standing at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, where the Silk Road reached the Mediterranean world, Constantinople became the wealthiest city in Christendom. The Byzantine Empire, which endured for over 1,000 years from the fall of Rome in 476 CE until Constantinople's conquest in 1453, was the western terminus of the Silk Road and a major market for Chinese silk. Byzantine aristocrats and clergy wore robes of silk that symbolized their wealth and power, and the imperial purple dye, made from thousands of murex snails, was reserved exclusively for the emperor himself. The Byzantines eventually obtained silkworm eggs, smuggled out of China according to legend by 2 Nestorian monks who hid them in hollow bamboo canes around 552 CE, breaking China's ancient monopoly on silk production. The caravanserais that dotted the Silk Road were architectural marvels in their own right, designed specifically for the needs of traveling merchants. These were fortified buildings, often constructed around a large central courtyard where camels could be unloaded and tethered for the night. The ground floor typically housed the animals in storage for goods, while the upper floors provided sleeping quarters for travelers. Thick walls and strong gates protected against bandits, and wells or cisterns ensured a supply of precious water. Some caravanserais were simple and functional, while others, especially those built by wealthy rulers eager to encourage trade, featured elaborate decorations, baths, and even mosques or temples. A merchant could travel the entire length of the Silk Road, moving from one caravanserai to the next, rarely more than a day's journey apart, each one offering sanctuary from the dangers and hardships of the road. The religions of the Silk Road created a tapestry of faiths unlike anywhere else in the world. Buddhism, as we've mentioned, spread from India through Central Asia into China, but it was far from the only religion traveling these routes. Nestorian Christianity, a branch that had broken with the Roman Church, established communities from Persia all the way to Chang'an. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion of fire and light, was practiced in many trading cities. Manichaeism, a faith that blended elements of Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, spread along the Silk Road before eventually fading away. Islam, after its founding in the 7th century, spread rapidly along these routes, eventually becoming the dominant religion in much of Central Asia. In some cities, temples, churches, mosques, and monasteries stood within sight of one another, their bells and calls to prayer mingling in the desert air, a testament to the remarkable religious tolerance that trade and prosperity could foster. The term Silk Road itself is actually quite modern, coined not by ancient travelers but by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. For thousands of years, the people who lived and worked along these routes had no single name for them. They were simply the roads, the paths, the ways between here and there. Von Richthofen's romantic name captured the imagination of scholars and the public alike, and it has stuck ever since, though perhaps Silk Roads would be more accurate, acknowledging the multiple routes and branches that comprise this vast network. Let yourself drift now, imagining the slow pace of camel caravans, the weeks and months spent crossing deserts and mountains, the patient accumulation of distance. Picture the moment when a traveler crests a final dune and sees, shimmering in the heat, the walls and towers of an oasis city, the promise of rest and fresh water, of human voices and the bustle of markets. Feel the weight of history, the countless footsteps that wore paths across the earth, the dreams of profit and adventure that drew people into the unknown. The Silk Road was a testament to human courage and curiosity, to our endless desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. As our journey continues along these ancient pathways, let us explore the remarkable technologies in everyday lives that made Silk Road trade not just possible, but sustainable across centuries. The preservation of perishable goods during months-long journeys was an art in itself. Dried fruits became some of the most valuable trade items, with raisins, dates, and apricots traveling in sealed containers or wrapped in protective leaves. Honey, precious for its sweetness and preservative qualities, was transported in ceramic jars sealed with wax. But perhaps most ingenious was the transport of ice and snow from mountain peaks down to desert cities, a luxury trade that existed long before modern refrigeration. Workers would cut blocks of ice from glaciers, wrap them in felt and straw for insulation, and raced them down mountain paths to wealthy customers in cities like Samarkand and Baghdad, where a cup of cold sherbet in the blazing summer heat was worth a small fortune. The ancient city of Kashgar, situated at the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert where routes from China met paths coming from India, Persia, and the steppes, has been a continuously inhabited trading center for over 2,000 years. Its Sunday market, which still operates today, has been held weekly for centuries, perhaps millennia, making it one of the oldest continuously operating markets in the world. In its heyday, Kashgar's bazaar would have been a kaleidoscope of humanity, with Chinese merchants displaying jade and silk beside Indian traders offering cotton and spices, while Persian craftsmen sold glassware and Central Asian nomads brought horses and furs. The city changed hands many times throughout history, controlled at various points by Chinese, Tibetan, Arab, Mongol, and Turkic powers, each leaving their mark on its culture and architecture. Music and musical instruments traveled the Silk Road just as surely as spices and silk, carrying melodies and rhythms across continents. The pipa, a pear-shaped lute that became central to Chinese classical music, actually originated in Persia and traveled eastward along the trade routes. Similarly, the two-stringed eru, now considered quintessentially Chinese, has Central Asian ancestors. Moving westward, musical traditions from China and India influenced Persian and Arab music, creating new forms and styles. Even the concept of musical notation, the idea of writing down music so it could be preserved and shared, traveled along these routes, with different cultures developing their own systems for capturing the ephemeral beauty of sound. The Silk Road also facilitated advances in medical knowledge and practice. Chinese physicians learned of new herbs and healing techniques from India and Persia, while Arab doctors incorporated Chinese methods like acupuncture and pulse diagnosis into their own practices. The great Persian physician and philosopher Avicenna, who lived from 980 to 1037 CE, wrote medical texts that drew on knowledge from multiple traditions, and his works eventually traveled both east to China and west to Europe, where they were studied in medieval universities. Rhubarb, valued in Chinese medicine for its digestive properties, became so sought after in the West that it was worth more than many precious gems, and specific varieties known as Turkey rhubarb commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. The production of a single piece of Chinese silk was an extraordinarily labor-intensive process that helps explain why it was so valuable. Silk begins with the Bombyx mori moth, whose caterpillars, the silkworms, feed exclusively on mulberry leaves. A single cocoon contains a filament of silk roughly 1,000 to 3,000 feet long, but this strand is so fine that it takes the silk from about 2,500 cocoons to make just 1 pound of raw silk. The cocoons must be carefully heated to kill the pupae inside without damaging the silk, then unwound in hot water and twisted together with other strands to create thread strong enough to weave. The entire process, from cultivating mulberry trees to the final woven fabric, could take months and required the skilled labor of many workers. It's no wonder that silk commanded such high prices in distant markets. The exchange of astronomical and mathematical knowledge along the Silk Road had profound impacts on human understanding of the cosmos. Indian numerals, including the revolutionary concept of zero, traveled through Persia and into Europe, eventually becoming the Arabic numerals we use today. Chinese astronomers learned of the Ptolemaic system of the heavens from Persian scholars, while Arab astronomers built upon Greek, Indian, and Chinese observations to create increasingly accurate star charts and calendars. The astrolabe, that beautiful instrument for measuring the positions of stars and planets, was refined through contributions from multiple cultures along the Silk Road, becoming an essential tool for both navigation and religious observation. In the mountains of Afghanistan stood the great Buddhas of Bamiyan, two monumental statues carved into a cliff face in the 6th century CE. The larger Buddha stood 175 feet tall, the smaller 120 feet, and both were situated along a key branch of the Silk Road. These colossal figures weren't merely religious symbols but also served as landmarks visible for miles, guiding caravans through the mountains. The caves and monasteries surrounding the Buddhas hosted travelers and pilgrims for over 1,000 years. The statues' faces and hands were made of wood and covered in decorated plaster, while the bodies were carved directly from the sandstone cliff. Sadly, these ancient wonders were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, but for centuries they stood as testament to the artistic achievements and religious devotion that flourished along the Silk Road. The weapons and military technology that moved along the Silk Road changed the face of warfare across continents. The composite bow, perfected by Central Asian nomads, could shoot arrows with devastating force and accuracy while being compact enough to use from horseback. These bows were made from multiple materials: wood, horn, and sinew, carefully laminated together and requiring months or even years to cure properly. Arab and Persian metalworkers developed Damascus steel, a material so superior in strength and sharpness that it seemed almost magical to those who encountered it. The secret of its production was eventually lost, but swords made from Damascus steel were prized throughout the medieval world. Meanwhile, the stirrup, that simple piece of equipment that seems obvious in retrospect, revolutionized cavalry warfare and traveled from China through Central Asia to Europe, fundamentally changing how battles were fought. Breathe slowly now, and picture the patient work of artisans, the careful cultivation of silkworms, the precise calculations of astronomers under star-filled desert skies. Imagine the sound of merchants haggling in Kashgar's ancient market, the melody of a Persian lute being learned by a Chinese musician, the sight of those towering Buddhas watching over mountain passes. The Silk Road was not just a conduit for objects but for human ingenuity itself, each innovation building upon the last, each culture contributing its own genius to the collective knowledge of humanity. Let us turn now to the stories of women along the Silk Road, so often invisible in historical accounts, yet vital to the functioning of these ancient networks of trade and culture. Princess Wencheng of the Tang dynasty embarked on one of the most significant diplomatic journeys in Silk Road history when she traveled to Tibet in 641 CE to marry the Tibetan king Sonsan Gampo. Her journey took 3 years, a slow procession through mountain passes and plateaus, bringing with her not just a political alliance but an entire cultural exchange. She carried Buddhist scriptures, Chinese artisans, agricultural experts, and technologies that would transform Tibetan society. The princess is credited with introducing the cultivation of vegetables and grains to Tibet, and her influence helped spread Buddhism in the region. Centuries after her death, she was revered almost as a deity, temples were built in her honor, and her marriage journey became legendary, a testament to how a single person could serve as a bridge between civilizations. The role of women in silk production itself was absolutely central, though often overlooked. In China, sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, was traditionally women's work, passed down from mother to daughter across generations. Women tended the mulberry groves, fed the silkworms by hand with fresh leaves multiple times each day, monitored the temperature and humidity of the rooms where the worms were kept, harvested the cocoons at precisely the right moment, and performed the delicate work of reeling the silk thread. An ancient Chinese text states that the mythical Yellow Emperor's wife, Lei Zhu, discovered silk around 2700 BCE when a cocoon fell into her tea and began to unravel, revealing the lustrous thread within. Whether true or not, this legend recognizes the feminine origins of one of history's most important industries. The city of Bokhara, in what is now Uzbekistan, emerged as one of the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world during the Silk Road's Golden Age. By the 9th and 10th centuries CE, Bokhara had become a beacon of learning, home to magnificent libraries, madrasas, and scholars who made groundbreaking advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The great scholar Al-Biruni, born near Bokhara in 973 CE, mastered multiple languages including Arabic, Persian, Greek, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, allowing him to access knowledge from across the known world. He calculated the Earth's radius with remarkable accuracy, wrote extensively on Indian mathematics and astronomy, and produced works on subjects ranging from pharmacology to mineralogy. Bokhara's prosperity, built on Silk Road trade, enabled this flowering of knowledge, proving that commerce and culture were inseparable companions. The horses of Central Asia were among the most prized commodities moving along the Silk Road, and none were more legendary than the so-called heavenly horses of Fergana, in modern-day Uzbekistan. Chinese emperors became obsessed with these magnificent animals after Zhang Qian's reports described their power and beauty. These horses were said to be taller and stronger than Chinese breeds, with incredible stamina, and according to legend, they would sweat blood during exertion, though this was likely caused by parasites under their skin. Emperor Wu of Han was so determined to obtain these horses that he launched military campaigns into Central Asia between 104 and 102 BCE, eventually securing a supply. The horses became symbols of imperial power and status, depicted in countless sculptures and paintings, and Chinese nobility would pay fortunes to own them. A good horse could be worth as much as a large house, and herds of these prized animals moved eastward along the Silk Road, guarded as carefully as any shipment of silk or gold. The spread of grape cultivation and wine-making along the Silk Road represents one of the most delightful examples of cultural exchange. Grapes were cultivated in the Caucasus and Persia for thousands of years before Chinese traders encountered them. By the Han Dynasty, grapevines had been introduced to China, where they were initially grown in imperial gardens as exotic curiosities. Winemaking followed, and Chinese poets of the Tang Dynasty wrote verses celebrating wine from the western regions, praising its effects on inspiration and creativity. The famous poet Li Bai, who lived from 701 to 762 CE, was renowned for composing his greatest works while intoxicated, and many of his poems mention wine from grapes. Meanwhile, traveling in the opposite direction, Chinese peach trees were planted in Persian gardens, their blossoms and fruits becoming beloved symbols in Persian poetry and art. The postal system established by the Mongols during the 13th century was among the most sophisticated communication networks of the medieval world. Known as the Yam system, It employed an estimated 50,000 horses stationed at regular intervals across the empire, along with riders, guides, and support staff. A messenger carrying urgent information could ride at full gallop to the next station, quickly switch to a fresh horse, and continue without delay. This relay system meant that news and commands could travel up to 200 miles in a single day, an astonishing speed for the time. The system was so reliable that merchants and travelers could also purchase tokens allowing them to use these postal stations, turning the network into something resembling a courier service. Marco Polo wrote admiringly of this system, noting that it surpassed anything in Europe. Paper money, one of China's revolutionary innovations, began its journey westward along the Silk Road during the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongol rulers of China attempted to implement it throughout their empire. The concept was almost incomprehensible to foreign merchants at first. How could paper have value? In the West, money meant coins of precious metal, gold or silver or copper, something with inherent worth. But the Chinese had been using paper currency since the Tang dynasty, and by the 13th century, it was the standard medium of exchange. The Mongols issued paper notes backed by silk and precious metals, and severe penalties, including death, awaited anyone who refused to accept them or who tried to counterfeit them. Marco Polo devoted an entire chapter of his book to describing this marvel, explaining to his skeptical European audience how paper could function as money. Though paper currency didn't take hold in Europe for several more centuries, the idea had been planted, one more seed traveling along the ancient trade routes. The technique of making porcelain, that most refined of ceramics, remained a Chinese secret for centuries, as closely guarded as the secrets of silk production. True porcelain requires specific types of clay, particularly kaolin, and must be fired at extremely high temperatures, around 1,300 degrees Celsius, to achieve its characteristic translucence and strength. Chinese porcelain began appearing in Middle Eastern markets during the Tang dynasty, and by the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279 CE, it had become a major export. Islamic potters tried for centuries to recreate Chinese porcelain but could only manage imitations. The beautiful blue and white porcelain that we often associate with Chinese ceramics actually resulted from cross-cultural influence. The cobalt blue pigment used for decoration was imported from Persia, while the white porcelain body was pure Chinese artistry. These ceramic masterpieces traveled the Silk Road wrapped in straw and felt, packed carefully in wooden crates, each piece a fusion of Eastern technique and Western materials. Rest now in the quiet spaces between these stories, in the cool shade of a caravanserai courtyard, in the rustle of silk being unfurled, in the soft footfalls of a princess's procession winding through mountain passes. The Silk Road lives in these moments, in the exchange of a copper coin for a handful of grapes, in the careful hands of a woman tending silkworms, in the thunder of hooves as postal riders race across steppes with urgent news. Let these images settle gently in your mind as sleep draws near. As we continue our nocturnal journey along these ancient paths, let us explore the spiritual seekers and the sacred texts that traveled alongside merchants and their goods, for the Silk Road was as much a highway of faith as it was of commerce. One of the most extraordinary travelers of the Silk Road was a Chinese Buddhist monk named Xuanzang, who in 629 CE defied an imperial travel ban to embark on a 17-year pilgrimage to India in search of authentic Buddhist scriptures. His journey took him through some of the most treacherous terrain on earth, across the Gobi Desert where he nearly died of thirst, over the Tian Shan Mountains where avalanches threaten constantly, and through kingdoms both welcoming and hostile. Xuanzang reached the great Buddhist University of Nalanda in India, where he studied for years with the greatest Buddhist scholars of his time, learning Sanskrit and collecting hundreds of sacred texts. When he finally returned to Chang'an in 645 CE, he was greeted as a hero, despite having left illegally. The emperor pardoned him and provided resources for him to translate the 657 Buddhist texts he had brought back, a task that would occupy the rest of his life. His detailed account of his travels became an invaluable historical record, and centuries later, his journey inspired the famous Chinese novel Journey to the West. The Jewish communities along the Silk Road created a remarkable network that stretched from Mediterranean ports to Kaifeng in eastern China. Jewish merchants, often called Radhanites, spoke multiple languages and maintained trading connections across religious and political boundaries that divided others. In the city of Kaifeng, a Jewish community flourished for over 1,000 years, building synagogues and maintaining their traditions while also integrating into Chinese society. They became so thoroughly Chinese in appearance and custom that by the time European visitors encountered them in the 19th century, they were virtually indistinguishable from their neighbors, except for their religious practices and the ancient Torah scrolls they preserved. These communities demonstrate how the Silk Road enabled not just trade but the preservation of culture and identity across vast distances. The art of carpet weaving reached its pinnacle along the Silk Road, particularly in Persia and Central Asia, where nomadic traditions merged with urban craftsmanship. A single high-quality Persian carpet might take skilled weavers an entire year to complete, working day after day to tie thousands of tiny knots, creating intricate patterns that told stories or depicted gardens of paradise. These carpets were not merely floor coverings but portable wealth, artworks that could be rolled up and carried, that improved with age, and that served multiple purposes as prayer rugs, bedding, room dividers, and insulation against cold. The natural dyes used in traditional carpet making, derived from plants, minerals, and insects, created colors that lasted for centuries. A wealthy merchant might commission a carpet in Tabriz or Isfahan and have it shipped along the Silk Road to grace the palace of a Chinese official or the home of a Byzantine aristocrat. The spread of viticulture along the Silk Road brought with it the art of glassmaking, as wine merchants needed suitable containers for their precious liquid. The techniques of glassblowing, developed in the Roman Empire around the 1st century BCE, gradually spread eastward. Syrian glassmakers were particularly renowned for their skill, creating vessels of startling clarity and delicate beauty. Chinese craftsmen were amazed by glass when they first encountered it, calling it water jade or crystal from the western regions. By the Tang dynasty, glassmaking workshops had been established in China, though Chinese artisans developed their own distinctive styles, often creating glass that was more opaque and heavily colored than the transparent Roman style. Glass vessels became luxury items, traded back and forth along the Silk Road, each culture influencing the other's designs and techniques. The city of Merv, located in what is now Turkmenistan, was once one of the largest cities in the world. During the 12th century, Merv may have had a population of over 200,000 people, making it comparable in size to Constantinople or Baghdad. The city sat at a crucial junction where routes from Persia met paths coming from Afghanistan and China, and it became fabulously wealthy from taxing and facilitating trade. Merv was known for its sophisticated irrigation systems that brought water from distant rivers to transform the surrounding desert into productive farmland. The city boasted impressive libraries, astronomical observatories, and architectural wonders, including a massive city wall that enclosed an area of several square miles. Tragically, when the Mongols conquered Merv in 1221, they destroyed the city so thoroughly that it never fully recovered, and today only ruins remain of this once great metropolis. The concept of quarantine, now so familiar to us, has its origins in the practices developed along the Silk Road and in the port cities where Silk Road goods arrived by ship. During the Black Death pandemic of the 14th century, the Venetian-controlled port of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik in Croatia, implemented a policy requiring arriving ships to anchor offshore for 30 days, a period called Trentino. Venice later extended this to 40 days, quarantino in Italian, from which we get the word quarantine. This was one of humanity's first systematic attempts to control the spread of infectious disease through regulated isolation. The practice reflected hard-won knowledge that diseases could be carried by travelers and trade goods, a lesson learned at terrible cost as plague swept repeatedly along the Silk Road routes. The pigments and dyes that traveled the Silk Road were often worth as much as precious metals. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone mined in the mountains of Afghanistan, was ground into powder to create ultramarine, the most prized blue pigment in the medieval world. Artists from Persia to Europe treasured ultramarine for painting the robes of the Virgin Mary and other important religious figures, and its journey from the mines of Badakhshan to the studios of Renaissance painters exemplified the Silk Road's reach. Similarly, the crimson dye made from Kermes insects, tiny creatures that lived on oak trees around the Mediterranean, was traded eastward and commanded astronomical prices. The desire for new colors and materials for artistic expression drove trade as surely as the hunger for spices or the market for silk. In the 8th century CE, the city of Samarkand became home to one of the first paper mills outside of China when Arab forces, having captured Chinese papermakers at the Battle of Talas, established the industry in Central Asia. From Samarkand, the technology spread throughout the Islamic world. Baghdad established major paper production by the late 8th century, and from there the technique reached Egypt, Morocco, and eventually Spain, entering Europe through the Islamic territories in Iberia. The impact of this technology transfer cannot be overstated. Paper's relative cheapness compared to parchment or papyrus democratized writing and learning, enabling the preservation and spread of knowledge on an unprecedented scale. The great Islamic libraries of the medieval period, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, were only possible because of paper. The Silk Road had carried not just a technology but a revolution in human communication. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, matching the patient rhythm of weavers at their looms, the steady footsteps of pilgrims on dusty roads, the gentle turning of pages in ancient libraries. Imagine Xuanzang studying by lamplight in Nalanda, his fingers tracing Sanskrit characters. Picture the vibrant blues and reds of a Persian carpet taking shape knot by knot. See the great walls of Merv rising from the desert, a monument to human ambition now returned to dust. The Silk Road whispers these stories to us across the centuries, tales of connection and exchange, of human dreams made manifest in dye and glass and sacred text. As we move deeper into the night and deeper into our journey, let us explore the everyday details of life along the Silk Road, the practicalities that made these epic journeys possible, and the cultural practices that travelers carried with them like invisible cargo. The language of commerce along the Silk Road required interpreters and translators, and these individuals were among the most valued members of any caravan. A skilled translator who could speak Chinese, Persian, Sogdian, and Turkic languages might earn as much as a successful merchant, for without translation, deals could not be made, contracts could not be written, and disputes could not be resolved. Some cities along the route became known as polyglot centers where 5, 6, or even more languages could be heard in the markets on any given day. Children growing up in these cosmopolitan oases often learned multiple languages from birth, becoming valuable assets to their families' trading enterprises. The standardization of weights and measures was another crucial challenge. A pound in one city might not equal a pound in another, and merchants had to carefully navigate these differences, often carrying their own scales and measures to ensure fair transactions. The concept of the bill of exchange, an early form of banking that allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, developed along the Silk Road out of practical necessity. Carrying large amounts of gold or silver across thousands of miles was not only physically burdensome but incredibly dangerous, an invitation to bandits and thieves. Instead, sophisticated networks of trust developed where a merchant could deposit funds with a banking house in, say, Constantinople, receive a written note, and then present that note to an associated banking house in Samarkand or Baghdad to receive the equivalent funds, minus a fee for the service. This system, which predated modern banking by centuries, relied entirely on reputation and family networks. The Sogdian and Jewish merchant communities were particularly skilled at maintaining these networks of trust across vast distances. Tea, which would eventually become one of the world's most important traded commodities, began its journey along the Silk Road during the Tang dynasty. Initially compressed into dense bricks for easier transport, tea traveled primarily along the southwestern routes through Tibet and into Central Asia. The tea brick served multiple purposes. It was commodity, currency, and nutrition all in one. Travelers could shave off portions to brew, and in some regions, these tea bricks became a form of money, with standardized weights and stamps indicating their value. The Tibetans developed their distinctive butter tea, mixing the brewed tea with yak butter and salt, a high-calorie drink perfectly suited to the harsh mountain climate. By the Song dynasty, between 960 and 1279 CE, China was exporting substantial quantities of tea to Central Asian peoples, establishing a trade relationship that would intensify over the following centuries. The Uyghur people, Turkic inhabitants of the Darine Basin in what is now Xinjiang, played an essential role as intermediaries and facilitators of Silk Road trade. The Uyghur Kingdom, which flourished from the 8th to the 13th centuries, controlled key oasis cities including Turpan and Qarshar. The Uyghurs adopted Manichaeism as their state religion in the 8th century before later converting to Buddhism, making their kingdom unusual in its religious tolerance and diversity. They developed a sophisticated written script, adapted from Sogdian, which was later adopted by the Mongols for their own language. Uyghur merchants were renowned for their honesty and business acumen, and they established trading colonies throughout China and Mongolia. Their kingdom served as a crucial buffer and bridge between the Chinese and Central Asian worlds, facilitating cultural and economic exchange for centuries. The postal relay systems of the Silk Road were not merely for official government use. Private correspondence also flowed along these routes, though at a much slower pace than urgent imperial dispatches. Merchants would entrust letters to trusted travelers heading in the right direction, creating informal mail networks. Some letters that have survived in the dry climates of Central Asia reveal intimate details of Silk Road life: a trader writing home to reassure his family of his safety, a woman in one city corresponding with relatives hundreds of miles away, business partners coordinating shipments and discussing prices. One remarkable cache of letters, known as the Sogdian Ancient Letters, was discovered in an abandoned watchtower along the Silk Road in western China. Dating to around 313 CE, these letters, written in Sogdian language and script on paper, tell of merchants stranded by warfare, of business partnerships strained by distance, of the very human concerns that underlay the grand narrative of trade. The animals of the Silk Road extended far beyond the famous Bactrian camels and Fergana horses. Falcons, trained for hunting, were traded as luxury goods, with the finest birds commanding prices that could bankrupt lesser nobles. Hunting with trained raptors was an art practiced from China to Europe, and a master falconer's skills were valued across cultures. Elephants, though they could not traverse the entire route, moved along southern branches of the Silk Road, particularly through India and Southeast Asia, valued for warfare, royal processions, and as symbols of power and wealth. Even peacocks traveled from India westward, their iridescent plumage and distinctive calls making them prized additions to royal menageries and gardens. Dogs too were traded, with different breeds valued for hunting, guarding, or companionship. The movement of these animals represented not just commerce but the exchange of knowledge about animal husbandry, training techniques, and veterinary care. The practice of grafting fruit trees, a horticultural technique that allows superior varieties to be propagated, spread along the Silk Road and transformed agriculture in multiple regions. The technique, perfected in China, involved joining a cutting from a desirable tree onto the rootstock of a hardier variety, combining the best qualities of both. Persian and Arab agriculturalists adopted and refined these methods, creating new varieties of apples, pears, and stone fruits. By the medieval period, sophisticated treatises on grafting and cultivation were being written in Arabic, Persian, and Chinese, with knowledge flowing in multiple directions. The famous Silk Road apple, the ancestor of many modern apple varieties, traveled from the mountains of Kazakhstan westward to Europe, its journey marked by the grafting and selection that created ever more diverse and delicious varieties. The astronomical observatories that were built in cities along the Silk Road represented collaborative scientific enterprises that drew on knowledge from multiple cultures. The observatory at Maraga in Persia, established in 1259 CE by the astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi under Mongol patronage, brought together scholars from across the Mongol Empire, including Chinese astronomers who brought their own observational techniques and instruments. The Maraga Observatory produced astronomical tables of unprecedented accuracy and developed mathematical models that would later influence Copernicus's heliocentric theory. This was science without borders, made possible by the connections and patronage that Silk Road trade created. Knowledge moved along these routes just as surely as silk and spices, and the observatories stand as monuments to human curiosity and the universal desire to understand the cosmos. Close your eyes and feel the weight of history settling like dust on ancient roads. Imagine the scratching of reed pens writing letters in a dozen scripts, the careful hands grafting one tree to another, the patient observation of stars wheeling overhead. The Silk Road was built on such details, on trust between strangers, on the courage to send words and goods across impossible distances, on the faith that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone was waiting to receive them. As our journey through the night deepens, let us turn to the kingdoms and empires that rose along the Silk Road's margins, and to the legacies that endure long after their walls have crumbled. The Kushan Empire, which flourished between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, controlled a vast territory stretching from northern India through Afghanistan and into Central Asia, positioning itself perfectly to dominate Silk Road trade during its golden age. The Kushans were originally nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes, but they transformed themselves into sophisticated rulers who embraced Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese influences. Their coinage is particularly revealing, featuring images of Greek gods, Buddha, Hindu deities, and Persian fire altars all together, a numismatic testament to the cultural fusion that characterized their realm. The greatest Kushan ruler, Kanishk, who reigned in the 2nd century CE, became a patron of Buddhism and convened the 4th Buddhist Council, helping to spread Mahayana Buddhism along the Silk Road. The Kushan Empire's prosperity was built almost entirely on its role as middleman in Silk Road commerce, taxing caravans and facilitating the exchange of goods between Rome, China, India, and Persia. The disease prevention and medical practices that developed along the Silk Road show remarkable sophistication. Travelers learned to boil water before drinking it in unfamiliar places, a practice that saved countless lives even though they didn't understand the microbial reasons behind its effectiveness. Certain herbs and medicinal plants were carried by caravans as essential supplies, camphor for fevers, ginger for digestion, and various substances believed to purify the air and ward off disease. Chinese merchants traveling west would bring supplies of dried ginger, tangerine peel, and other traditional medicines, while Persian and Arab traders carried their own pharmacopoeias eastward. The exchange of medical knowledge was sometimes formalized. Chinese physicians studied in Persian medical schools, and Persian doctors traveled to China to share their expertise. This medical exchange was accelerated by the terrible lessons of the plague, as societies desperately sought any knowledge that might protect them from future pandemics. The art of miniature painting reached extraordinary heights in Persia during the 14th and 15th centuries, an artistic tradition deeply influenced by Chinese painting techniques that had traveled along the Silk Road. After the Mongol conquests, Chinese artists were brought to Persian courts, and Persian artists were exposed to Chinese scrolls, techniques, and aesthetic principles. The result was a distinctive fusion style. Persian miniatures began incorporating Chinese landscape elements, cloud patterns, and perspectives on nature, while maintaining their own traditions of flat perspective, intricate detail, and brilliant color. These miniature paintings illustrated manuscripts of poetry, history, and romance, creating some of the most exquisite artworks in human history. A single manuscript might take years to complete, with master calligraphers writing the text and master painters creating illustrations of such delicacy that a magnifying glass reveals details invisible to the naked eye. The kingdom of Khotan, nestled in the southern branch of the Silk Road at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, maintained its independence for over 1,000 years by carefully balancing relationships with more powerful neighbors and by controlling valuable resources. Khotan was famous throughout the ancient world for its jade, mined from nearby mountains and riverbeds, carved by skilled artisans into objects ranging from simple ornaments to elaborate sculptures. The kingdom also became a major center of silk production after, according to legend, a Chinese princess smuggled silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds to Khotan by hiding them in her elaborate headdress when she came to marry the Khotanese king, sometime around the 4th century CE. Khotan was predominantly Buddhist, and the kingdom constructed hundreds of monasteries and stupas, becoming a significant center of Buddhist learning. The dry climate preserved many documents written in the Khotanese language, an Iranian language now extinct, providing scholars with invaluable insights into this sophisticated kingdom that thrived until the Islamic conquests of the 10th century. The practice of sericulture, the raising of silkworms, eventually spread beyond China despite imperial prohibitions and death penalties. By the 6th century CE, the Byzantine Empire had successfully established its own silk industry after obtaining silkworm eggs, breaking China's millennium-old monopoly. The Byzantines concentrated silk production in imperial workshops where conditions could be carefully controlled and secrets maintained. However, they could never quite match the quality of the finest Chinese silks, which continued to command premium prices. By the medieval period, silk was being produced in Persia, Central Asia, and eventually in Italy and Spain, though China remained the world's largest producer. Each region developed its own distinctive styles and patterns. Persian silks featured different motifs than Chinese silks, which differed from Byzantine work, creating a rich diversity of silk textiles that reflected the cultures that produced them. Salt, one of humanity's most essential commodities, was traded extensively along certain Silk Road routes, particularly in regions where it was scarce. In Tibet and Mongolia, where salt deposits were limited, this mineral was as valuable as spices, necessary not just for flavoring food but for preserving meat and maintaining health. Salt blocks were carried by caravans across mountain passes, and in some regions, salt served as currency. The Tibetan practice of adding salt to butter tea wasn't merely a matter of taste but a practical way to ensure adequate salt intake in a challenging environment. The monopolization of salt trade made fortunes for merchants and governments alike, and control of salt sources could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for entire regions. Along the Qinghai-Tibet route, a specific branch of the Silk Road, tea and salt were the primary commodities exchanged, with Chinese tea moving west and Tibetan salt, wool, and horses moving east. The invention of the mechanical clock, with its gears and escapements, has roots that intertwine with Silk Road exchanges of knowledge. Chinese engineers developed sophisticated water clocks and mechanical astronomical instruments centuries before similar devices appeared in Europe. The most famous was constructed by Su Song in 1094 CE, an astronomical clock tower over 30 feet tall that featured an armillary sphere, a celestial globe, and mechanical figures that marked the hours. Knowledge of these mechanisms traveled westward along with other technologies. Islamic scholars and engineers built upon Chinese innovations, creating their own sophisticated timekeeping devices. By the medieval period, European clockmakers were developing the first mechanical clocks, influenced by both Islamic and Chinese precedents. The mechanical clock, which would revolutionize how humans organized time and society, was thus another gift of cross-cultural exchange. the textiles that moved along the Silk Road extended far beyond silk itself. Cotton, first domesticated in the Indian subcontinent, gradually spread westward and eastward along the trade routes. By the medieval period, cotton cultivation had reached China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. The lightweight, breathable fabric was particularly valued in hot climates, and cotton textiles became major trade goods in their own right. Wool from various sources, including the fine wool from Tibetan yaks, the mohair from Angora goats, and cashmere from Kashmir, all found markets along the Silk Road. Linen from the Mediterranean, hemp fabrics from China, each textile carried with it not just material for clothing but the techniques of spinning, weaving, and dyeing that would be adopted and adapted by other cultures. The exchange of textile knowledge was as important as the exchange of the fabrics themselves. Weavers learned new patterns, new ways of organizing looms, new dyeing techniques that expanded the possibilities of their craft. Rest now in the knowledge of all that was exchanged, all that was shared, all that human beings created together across impossible distances. Feel the softness of silk, the weight of jade, the smoothness of cotton against your skin. Hear the gentle ticking of water clocks, see the brilliant colors of miniature paintings, taste the salt and butter tea. The Silk Road was humanity's first great collaborative project, a testament to our ability to connect, to trade, to learn from one another despite every barrier of distance, language, and custom. As we approach the final stretches of our nighttime journey, let us reflect on the decline of the Silk Road and the transformations that brought the age of the caravans to a close, as well as the echoes that remain with us still. The discovery of maritime routes around Africa fundamentally changed global trade patterns and contributed to the decline of the overland Silk Road. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached India, opening a sea route that bypassed the Middle Eastern and Central Asian middlemen who had controlled and profited from Silk Road trade for millennia. Sea transport could carry far larger quantities of goods than camel caravans, and while sea voyages had their own dangers, they avoided the numerous tolls, taxes, and difficulties of land travel. Within a few decades, European ships were sailing directly to China and Southeast Asia, and the economic logic that had sustained the Silk Road for thousands of years began to unravel. The great oasis cities that had thrived on caravan trade found themselves increasingly bypassed, their markets quieter, their caravanserais less crowded. The rise of gunpowder empires in the 15th and 16th centuries also disrupted traditional Silk Road patterns. The Ottoman Empire controlled much of the western portion of the routes, the Safavid Persian Empire dominated the center, and the Mughal Empire controlled India, while China was unified under the Ming dynasty. These powerful centralized states often pursued policies that hindered rather than facilitated long-distance trade, imposing heavy tariffs, restricting the movement of merchants, or outright closing borders during conflicts. The Ming dynasty, beginning in 1368, initially pursued some of the most ambitious maritime expeditions in history under Admiral Zheng He, whose treasure fleets dwarfed any European vessels of the time. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa. However, after these expeditions ended, the Ming gradually turned inward, eventually restricting foreign trade and showing less interest in the western regions that had once been so important to Tang dynasty China. The final blow to the classical Silk Road came with political fragmentation and instability in Central Asia. As the Mongol Empire collapsed in the 14th century, the unified protection that had enabled the Pax Mongolica disappeared. The region fragmented into competing khanates and emirates that were often at war with one another. The rise of the Timurid Empire under Timur, also known as Tamerlane, brought brief periods of stability in the late 14th century, but Timur's conquests were often devastating to the cities in his path. He conquered Delhi in 1398 and Damascus in 1400, and while his capital at Samarkand enjoyed a cultural renaissance, becoming a center of art and learning, the broader region suffered from warfare and instability. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire gradually fragmented, and Central Asia entered a long period of political chaos that made overland trade increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Yet the Silk Road's legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The botanical gardens of Europe, filled with plants from Asia, were living monuments to Silk Road exchanges. Tulips, which would become so associated with the Netherlands that they sparked the famous tulip mania speculation bubble of the 1630s, actually originated in Central Asia and were brought to Europe through Ottoman Turkey. The word tulip itself comes from the Turkish word for turban, reflecting the flower's shape. Similarly, the cafes of Europe trace their lineage to coffee houses that first appeared in Constantinople and other Ottoman cities, serving coffee that had traveled from Ethiopia through Yemen and into the Islamic world. By the 17th century, coffee and tea had both become important global commodities, and the taste for these beverages, acquired through Silk Road contacts, reshaped European social life and colonial ambitions. The great Silk Road cities, though they declined in commercial importance, often preserved remarkable architectural and cultural heritage. Samarkand's Registan, a public square surrounded by 3 magnificent madrasas, educational institutions built between the 15th and 17th centuries, stands as one of the most beautiful examples of Islamic architecture in the world. The blue-tiled facades, the intricate geometric patterns, the soaring portals and domes, all speak to the wealth and sophistication that Silk Road trade had once brought to the city. Even as trade declined, these monuments remained, serving new purposes but always reminding visitors of the glory days when caravans converged from every direction, when merchants from 100 lands crowded the bazaars, when Samarkand truly was a crossroads of the world. The rediscovery of the Silk Road by European explorers and scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries sparked renewed interest in these ancient routes. Archaeologists and adventurers, including Aurel Stein, Paul Pelliot, and Albert von Lecoq, led expeditions to the deserts of Central Asia, excavating ruined cities, discovering ancient manuscripts, and removing artifacts that now fill museums around the world. Stein's expeditions between 1900 and 1916 were particularly significant, discovering the library cave at Dunhuang and excavating numerous sites along the old trade routes. These expeditions were not without controversy, as local populations and governments protested what they saw as theft of their cultural heritage. The manuscripts, paintings, and artifacts removed during this period remain sources of scholarly study and diplomatic tension even today, with many countries seeking the return of materials taken a century ago. The concept of the Silk Road has experienced a remarkable revival in the 21st century. China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, explicitly invokes the Silk Road as a model for modern economic development and international cooperation. This massive infrastructure project aims to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through both overland routes, the Belt, and maritime routes, the Road, investing in ports, railways, highways, and other infrastructure across dozens of countries. While the modern initiative involves technologies and scales of investment that ancient merchants could never have imagined, container ships and high-speed rail rather than camels and horses, the underlying vision echoes the Silk Road's ancient premise that prosperity flows from connection, that barriers between peoples can become bridges, that exchange enriches all participants. The Silk Road's influence on modern cuisine is perhaps its most delicious legacy. The fusion of culinary traditions that began along the trade routes continues to evolve today. Consider the dumpling, that simple combination of dough and filling that appears in nearly every culture along the ancient Silk Road, from Chinese jiaozi to Central Asian mantai to Italian ravioli, each variation reflecting local tastes but all sharing a common ancestor that probably traveled the trade routes. Noodles themselves, long claimed by both Italian and Chinese traditions, may have been independently invented or may have traveled from China to Italy through intermediary cultures. The very notion of a noodle, long strands of wheat dough, embodies the kind of cultural exchange the Silk Road facilitated. Today's global cuisine, where ingredients and techniques from around the world combine in creative ways, is the Silk Road's truest descendant, proof that the exchange of food and flavors across cultures creates something greater than the sum of its parts. Let yourself sink deeper now into rest, into dreams perhaps of caravans that no longer travel, of cities whose stones still stand in testimony to vanished glory. The Silk Road lives on in the tulips that bloom each spring, in the coffee you drink each morning, in the noodles on your dinner table. It lives in the very idea that distance need not divide us, that what seems foreign can become familiar, that exchange enriches rather than diminishes. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you this knowledge: the Silk Road never truly ended, it simply transformed, becoming the invisible network of connections that still binds our world together.